Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
For years, prosecutors across the United States relied on a diagnosis known as shaken baby syndrome to explain the sudden deaths of infants and toddlers. In many cases, that diagnosis became the foundation for criminal convictions. But over time, some doctors and forensic experts began questioning the science behind it. In 2002, a 2-year-old girl in Texas died after being rushed to the hospital. Her father was later accused of shaking her to death and was ultimately sentenced to death. More than 20 years later, his case has become part of a growing debate over whether some convictions may have relied on flawed or misunderstood evidence. This is Forensic Tales, episode 327, The Story of Robert Roberson. It's a topic no one ever likes to talk about, children passing away. And it's even harder to imagine that a child can lose their life at the hands of one of their own parents. It's one of the ugliest parts of society to talk about, but it's the very topic covered in this episode. So please take care of yourself while listening. On January 31st, 2002, a then 35-year-old Robert Roberson rushed through the emergency doors at a Texas hospital carrying his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki. She had been born in October of 1999, and Robert had just recently gotten custody of her after paternity tests proved he was her father. Before that, Nikki had lived with her maternal grandparents after her mother lost custody due to drug issues. Robert initially told the doctors and nurses that she had fallen out of her bed and wasn't responsive or breathing by the time he woke up and found her on the floor. Then he told different nurses that she had hit her head on a table next to the bed. More on his changing stories a little later on. It was a story that could break even the most hardened hearts of hospital staff. You never want to see a child, especially not one as young as Nikki was, being rushed into the emergency room unresponsive. But regardless of how they felt at that moment, the team of doctors and nurses got to work trying to save little Nikki's life. There just wasn't anything they could do by the time she got there. And by later that day, 2-year-old Nikki Michelle Curtis was pronounced dead. From practically the moment they arrived in the emergency room, the hospital staff didn't believe Robert's story about falling out of bed, whether it was from hitting the floor or the table. Nikki's injuries, especially the ones to her head, were just too severe. So the doctors and nurses immediately suspected they had a case of child abuse on their hands, and it's their legal and ethical responsibility to report these incidents to the police. And it wasn't just Nikki's injuries that raised red flags. It was also Robert's behavior while in the emergency room. They thought he seemed nervous and anxious, as if he were hiding something from them. What they didn't know was that Robert was autistic and had dropped out of school before finishing the 9th grade. So any of his behavior while at the hospital was probably misunderstood, something we'll talk about again a little later in the story. So, within just a couple of hours of Nikki's death, the police were notified and Robert was arrested the following day on murder charges. And under Texas law, if he was convicted, he was looking at either life in prison or the death penalty. All of this happened very, very quickly. There wasn't much of an investigation before it was concluded that Nikki had been abused at the hands of her father. The case against him became a case of shaken baby syndrome. Even though it was the hospital staff who first raised the alarm bells about abuse, it was also the medical examiner. Based on the autopsy, the medical examiner didn't believe her injuries could have come from a simple fall off the bed. It wasn't just that she had arrived in that emergency room with 1 or 2 bruises. She was covered in bruises and injuries. Here's what the medical examiner said in her report about that. She had a bruise on the back of her shoulder, a scraped elbow, a bruise over her right eyebrow, bruises on her chin, a bruise on her left cheek, an abrasion next to her left eye, multiple bruises on the back of her head, a torn frenulum in her mouth, bruising on the inner surface of the lower lip, subscapular and subgaleal hemorrhaging between her skin and her skull, subarachnoid bleeding, subdural hematoma, both preretinal and retinal hemorrhages, and brain edema. So based on that, there was only one possible explanation: shaken baby syndrome. This little girl had been abused, and not just abused on one occasion. Some of these injuries suggested she had been a victim for a long time before coming into the emergency room. The term shaken baby syndrome, sometimes called abusive head trauma, is the most common cause of death or serious injury resulting from child abuse. This diagnosis first got its name in the mid-1970s in the U.S. and is still used today to describe infant or child abuse. In many cases of shaken baby syndrome, you don't see any visible signs of trauma or abuse on the baby. Most trauma occurs internally in parts of the head and brain. Over the years, doctors and researchers have identified many complications associated with shaken baby syndrome, like seizures, vision problems, cognitive impairment, and in severe cases, death. According to one study, 1 in every 4 babies who became victims of SBS died, and nearly 3 in 10,000 babies each year experience this type of abuse in the U.S. Most of the kids are younger than 5, so it might be more common than you think. When thinking of shaken baby syndrome, most people assume the parent or caregiver shakes the baby, and that's what causes head trauma. But shaking isn't the only cause. Blunt force trauma to a baby's head can also cause similar symptoms. And in other cases, it might be a combination of blunt force trauma and shaking. I know these are really difficult things to even talk about, and as a parent myself, it's just so heartbreaking. But the term shaken baby syndrome is the heart of this story, and it's something doctors and forensic experts have relied on for many, many years. Most studies suggest that this is usually caused by the parent or caregiver's frustration. They become frustrated because the baby won't eat, sleep, or stop crying. Sometimes the shaking goes too far, and the baby experiences head trauma. But diagnosing this isn't always easy, and not everyone agrees on which injuries qualify as SBS and which don't. It's even harder to properly diagnose when the injuries might be attributed to something else. But when it came to Robert and his daughter Nikki, everyone was on the same page. They all thought this was a clear case of child abuse and shaken baby syndrome. The doctors and nurses at the hospital, the medical examiner, the police, prosecutors, everyone. So that explains why, within just 24 hours of Nikki's passing, Robert was arrested and charged with her murder. He was accused of lying about her falling off the bed, and he was the one who intentionally caused her injuries. But Robert denied ever hurting Nikki, although according to the Texas Attorney General, who now has his case, they say he has changed his story about what happened, something I mentioned at the top of the episode. At first, he said she simply fell off the bed. Then he said she hit her head on a table next to the bed. But when he was questioned by the police for the first time, he reverted back to the story that Nikki had simply fallen out of bed. But later in another police interview, he said he had no idea what happened or what caused her head injuries, and allegedly blamed Nikki for being clumsy and falling often. At Robert's trial, he had everything to lose. Not only could he be convicted of murdering his own baby, but he also faced the death penalty. And we all know that Texas is a state that isn't afraid to execute people. We also want justice for 2-year-old Nikki. This was just a toddler who tragically lost her life. So the stakes were very, very high for both sides, no matter how you see this. Before we get into the forensic evidence, we have to talk about the mountain of circumstantial evidence against Robert. The first were claims about prior abuse. Robert's ex-wife testified that he had physically abused her while she was pregnant. She also said he was abusive toward their 2 older children. This was Robert's first wife, the woman he married before he met Nikki's mother. So this seemed to suggest he had a history of being abusive. If he was capable of abusing a pregnant woman, he could also be capable of doing something similar to a small child, according to prosecutors. But Robert's lawyers argued that his ex-wife had reason to lie about that. They said she was angry about losing the 2 children they shared together 2 years prior, after a very long and heated court battle. She was also angry about having to travel from Alabama to testify. So, according to the defense, that was all motivation to lie. But it wasn't just Robert's ex-wife who had bad things to say about him. Multiple witnesses testified that they had seen him shake Nikki on multiple previous occasions. Many of them said they were afraid to leave Nikki alone with him because he would repeatedly whip her whenever the baby cried. Testimony showed that he would strike her with his hands, a board, or even a paddle, and on at least one instance, threw her off the bed. Robert's own mother allegedly said at one time, "One of these days, he's going to kill her, and it's going to be too late for anyone to do anything about it." So this was a clear pattern of abuse that multiple people witnessed, according to the prosecution. Now, why didn't any of these witnesses call the police to report it? If the abuse was so bad and was witnessed by multiple people, including Robert's own mother, why didn't anyone speak up to save this girl's life? Well, I don't know. What we do know is that Robert's lawyers argued that just like his ex-wife, these witnesses were incredibly unreliable. Everyone who said they saw Robert shake Nikki was related to a woman named Teddy Cox, who was Robert's girlfriend at the time of Nikki's death. In particular, Teddy Cox had admitted that she changed her story several times. "Depending on how I feel at the moment." That's a direct quote from her. So, according to Robert's lawyers, these are witnesses who were biased and had motive to come up with false claims about prior incidents of abuse. The second piece was Robert's prior criminal record. To put it simply, he was no angel. Between 1991 and 1999, he had been convicted of several crimes, including burglary, theft, parole violations, and had been in and out of prison. Before his arrest for murder in 2002, he had just been released from prison 2 years earlier. So this was all evidence the jury considered when deciding whether this person was capable of shaking his baby or not. When it came to the forensic evidence at trial, it came down to 2 things: what the doctors and nurses witnessed firsthand in the emergency room and the medical examiner's report from the autopsy. Emergency room nurse Andrea Sims, who saw Nikki before any medical intervention was done, testified that besides bruising, Nikki also had a handprint on her face, and that the back of her skull was what she described as bruised and mushy. As far as the medical examiner's testimony, that was the nail in the coffin. She told the jury that Nikki died from substantial blunt force trauma, head injuries that clearly indicated she had been struck. According to her, the forensic evidence was clear. Nikki was abused by her father and died due to the trauma he inflicted. This went well beyond just shaking a crying baby a few times. This was blunt force trauma, and that was really all it took for a jury to decide. On February 14th, 2003, Valentine's Day, Robert was found guilty of capital murder inside an Anderson County, Texas courtroom. Next came his sentence, the death penalty. However, this is far from the end of the story, because for the next 23 years, the very thing that got him convicted, shaken baby syndrome, is the same thing that might actually spare his life. Part of my duty is to present all sides and information without bias. So, before I get to the appeals and where everything stands today, there are two things the state attorney's office alleges. The first is that Robert has since admitted to his cellmate that he sexually assaulted Nikki. I won't go into the details of exactly what prosecutors allege, but these are very serious allegations. The cellmate also claims that Robert told him that when he was upset at his female partner, he would take his anger out on his daughter. He told the cellmate that he would do things like hit her in the back of the head with his hand, or drop her on her head and leave her on the floor. The second thing they said in October of 2024 was that Robert wasn't convicted solely on the claims surrounding shaken baby syndrome. Here's a direct quote from their press release. Now, a coalition of activists and state legislators is interfering with the justice system in an unprecedented way in an attempt to stall or prevent Roberson's execution. They have attempted to mislead the public by falsely claiming that Roberson was unfairly convicted through junk science concerning shaken baby syndrome. The jury did not convict Roberson on the basis of shaken baby syndrome. The junk science objection that has been used as a pretext to interfere with the proceedings has no basis in reality, end quote. Don't worry, we'll get to what the Attorney General is talking about in all of these claims about junk science. Over the next decade, Robert filed 3 appeals. The first was denied by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in 2007, and 2 more were denied in May and August of 2015 by the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The appeals were based on a few things. The first was something I mentioned a little earlier in the episode, that Robert was autistic. So when the hospital staff thought his behavior was strange, they were simply misunderstanding him. And this was evidence that was presented against him at trial. The jury was told by multiple prosecution witnesses that his behavior pointed toward guilt. But according to his lawyers, his different behavior wasn't an indication of guilt, but rather a product of his autism. This was someone who was a special education student in school and dropped out before high school. There was also a psychologist named Thomas Allen who testified at trial, calling Robert a psychopath. He compared him to people like Ted Bundy and Hitler. And his diagnosis was largely based on the famous and now controversial psychopathy checklist that has played a role in over a dozen death sentences since 1998. This psychologist also talked about a previous sexual assault Robert had been accused of, but never led to prosecution due to a lack of evidence. But it's very hard for a jury to see past this after someone has already labeled a defendant a psychopath. The second and main part of his earlier appeals concerned the shaken baby claims. During the trial, the jury heard about all the injuries Nikki had sustained, the ones I laid out earlier in the episode. But according to the Innocence Project's appeals, those injuries had been reported by the medical examiner several days after Nikki had been brought into the emergency room. And while she was there, she went through significant life-saving measures by hospital staff. This included repeated intubation and having a pressure monitor surgically screwed into the top of her head. So they argued that a lot of the injuries reported by the medical examiner were actually caused by extensive medical procedures to try to save her life. They weren't all caused by alleged abuse, and certainly not shaken baby. When It specifically comes to the pressure monitor that had been screwed into her head. This procedure causes bruising and intracranial bleeding. Injuries, his attorneys say, weren't there when she was first brought in. They say they can prove this because apparently one of the nurses took some photos, and none of the head bruising was there before this procedure was done. They also said they weren't visible on the CT scans. But according to his attorneys, these photos have been locked up in the courtroom basement for years and weren't known about until this case became popular in the media. They certainly weren't handed over to the defense at his original trial, which also means they weren't presented to the jury. Instead, the jury was told that the location of this pressure monitoring device was an impact site. Another issue on appeal is Nikki's previous health issues. When she was taken to the emergency room that day, that wasn't the first time she'd been seen by doctors. In fact, for just being 2 years old, Nikki had a lot of chronic health issues that started soon after she was born. According to court documents, she had been sick with a high fever and what was later determined to be undiagnosed double pneumonia, which is a combination of both bacterial and viral. She had also been recently prescribed Phenergan and codeine, 2 medications that are no longer recommended for young children due to potential respiratory complications. So Robert's attorneys argue that Nikki's death had nothing to do with shaken baby syndrome or abuse. Instead, they say that it was the double pneumonia which led to sepsis that ultimately caused her death. But once again, to present both sides of the argument, prosecutors have repeatedly denied these claims on appeal. They say none of this new evidence disproves that Nikki had died from head injuries, or that those injuries weren't caused by him. Even if she had pneumonia and a few other health conditions, none of that explains the physical injuries, according to prosecutors. Robert's first execution date was set for June 21, 2016. At this point, he had exhausted all of his appeals, so things were getting toward the end of the road for him. However, just 4 days before he was scheduled to die, he was granted a stay of execution, and a court hearing was scheduled to review the case based on some of these newer findings about Nikki's prior health issues. The main issue was whether or not Robert's conviction should stand in light of the discredited theory of shaken baby syndrome. Let's talk about that. When the term was first developed in the 1970s, it was based on a triad of symptoms: subdural hematoma, retinal hemorrhage, and brain swelling. These were symptoms thought to prove violent shaking in babies. And by the 1980s, these 3 symptoms were accepted as definitive proof of abuse, often without evidence of external trauma. But by the 2000s, research started to show that this triad of symptoms could actually be caused by many other things other than child abuse or shaking, like short falls, illnesses, or even certain medical conditions. Other studies even suggest that shaking a baby hard enough to generate those symptoms would likely also result in a broken neck. So just because a child had these 3 symptoms, it doesn't automatically mean they were the victim of shaken baby syndrome. And according to the National Registry of Exonerations, over 40 convictions have been overturned after medical reexaminations were done. These were cases once thought to be shaken baby cases. So over the years, some people have criticized the triad of symptoms and have considered the whole shaken baby syndrome diagnosis to be junk science. This has really become something that has divided courts, doctors, lawyers, the police, and even forensic experts. Some call it junk science, while others completely disagree. Those who believe in it say it's a key to identifying and stopping child abuse. And at the end of the day, that's something we all want, no matter what you think about the shaken baby syndrome. When it came to Robert's stay of execution in 2016, his attorneys used Texas's junk science law, which basically allows prisoners to challenge convictions based on discredited forensic evidence or scientific developments. It gives them a pathway to a new trial if reliable science contradicts the original evidence. So their argument was that the whole premise of the shaken baby syndrome and its triad of symptoms, which can be caused by many other things, is, quote, junk science. And if that's the case, not only should the state of Texas stay his execution, but they should also grant him a new trial. In one sense, Robert's attorneys won. He wasn't executed in 2016. But on the other hand, it wasn't really a win either. That's because in January of 2023, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals decided that there was insufficient basis for the court to intervene in Robert's case. They said there was insufficient evidence to say that the concerns around shaken baby syndrome warrant him being taken off death row or revoking his conviction. Then, 10 months later, in October of 2023, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed and rejected another one of his appeals. By 2024, Robert had another execution date on the books, October 17th, 2024. By then, he had become the first death row prisoner convicted on the grounds of shaken baby syndrome to have an execution date in the United States. So whether or not this was actually going to happen was a big deal and had a lot of people watching. It was also around the same time that Robert Roberson started getting a lot of supporters from both sides of the political aisle, not just in Texas, but across the entire country. This has become a very, very big case that a lot of people started following. It had gained so much attention that a clemency petition was signed by 84 law members of the 150-member state house. It was also signed by many medical experts, death penalty attorneys, and even a former detective who worked the original investigation. The letter was sent to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles and asked that his sentence be reduced to life in prison. But the board unanimously voted against recommending clemency. With only days left before the execution, Robert's attorneys filed a final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, but that appeal was also rejected. Then just hours before the second execution was set to take place, a judge issued an order temporarily blocking it, but neither side was backing down, including prosecutors. The order was quickly challenged by the state, and another court briefly allowed the execution to move forward again. But in a last-minute intervention, the Texas Supreme Court stepped in and halted it, stopping it just before it was scheduled to occur. Whether you believe Robert Roberson is guilty or not, this was a very stressful time for everyone involved. If you think Robert is innocent, then you worry the state is about to execute an innocent man. Or even if you think he's guilty and this is the appropriate sentence, you worry about justice for Nikki slipping away. Again, I want to present both sides of this story to you. That brings us to 2025, just 1 year ago. In June of 2025, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton asked the court to set a new execution date after the case was transferred to his office. Then, about a month later in July, a judge scheduled it for October 16th, 2025. As that date approached, Robert made a very unexpected and unusual decision. In September 2025, he waived his right to request clemency, meaning he wouldn't ask the governor or parole board to spare his life. Instead, his legal team chose to focus all their efforts on trying to secure a new trial, arguing that the evidence used to convict him should be re-examined. But just when you think this story might be coming to an end, we're still not even close. This story is still very much unfolding. On October 9th, 2025, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued an emergency stay of execution, once again stopping it before it could take place. This happened just 1 week before Robert was scheduled to die. So that's now 2 times where he has come within hours or days of being executed. The court sent the case back to the trial court to review the medical evidence under Texas's 2013 junk science law, which, as I mentioned earlier, allows convictions to be challenged if the scientific evidence used at trial is later called into question. At the same time, Robert's lawyers filed a notice of new evidence after an episode of NBC's Dateline was released that same day. Their claim of judicial misconduct comes after the podcast presented evidence that Judge Bascom Bentley, who presided over the 2003 trial, improperly authorized the removal of life support from Nikki, despite lacking legal authority. What happened was that this judge was the one who allowed the hospital to take Nikki off life support after consulting with her maternal grandparents. They didn't allow Robert to be the one to make the decision, despite the fact that he had custody of her. The other big point to make is that his attorneys didn't even know about this until the Dateline podcast came out, nearly the same day he was supposed to be executed. So, where does the case stand today? Well, as of the time I'm recording this, the state of Texas hasn't rescheduled Robert's execution date. This is all pending the outcome of the shaken baby syndrome claims. Is it junk science, or was the forensic evidence strong enough to warrant a death sentence in this case? Was Nikki the victim of parental abuse, and that's what caused her death and the triad of symptoms associated with the syndrome? Or could her death be the result of the illnesses she suffered in the days and weeks leading up to her death? Could those medications she was prescribed, which are now banned for young children, have played a role in anything? This case certainly isn't the only one under close scrutiny. In July of 2024, just a few months before Robert's second execution date, the Michigan Supreme Court overturned a 2006 shaken baby murder conviction. Since then, 2 additional cases from Ohio have been rejected by higher courts, one after the medical examiner changed their assessment that a 3-year-old died of shaken baby syndrome to their belief that the child died from a short fall. And that's still not the end of it. Last year, a judge in New Jersey likened the shaken baby syndrome to junk science and noted that no study has ever validated the hypothesis that shaking a child can cause the triad of symptoms associated with shaken baby syndrome. An appellate court upheld that ruling. We've also covered a few other cases on the podcast covering this same topic, including Audrey Edmonds in episode 168 of the show. And just a few weeks ago, we covered the story of Melissa Lucio, although her case doesn't directly deal with shaken baby syndrome and the triad of symptoms. It's a case that's very similar to this one. In her case, there are still questions about whether Melissa's daughter was murdered or her death was simply an accident. Just like Robert, she's also on death row in the state of Texas. As far as what comes next for Robert Roberson, we will have to wait to see what the Texas courts decide. For now, the case remains tied to a much larger question that continues to surface in courtrooms across the country. What happens when the science used to convict someone is later challenged or re-examined? In Roberson's case, much of the original prosecution relied on medical testimony surrounding shaken baby syndrome, a diagnosis that has since become the subject of intense debate among doctors, researchers, and forensic experts. Supporters of Roberson argue that evolving medical knowledge may point to alternative explanations for Nikki Curtis's death. Others maintain that the evidence presented at trial still supports the original conclusion. Cases like this highlight something important about forensic science. It is not static. As research advances and our understanding of the human body improves, the way evidence is interpreted can change. And when that happens, the justice system is sometimes forced to revisit difficult questions about past convictions. Forensic science can be one of the most powerful tools investigators have. But as this case shows, it can also become the center of ongoing debate long after a verdict has been delivered. And for Robert Roberson, the final outcome is still uncertain. I will continue to follow this case and provide any updates as they become available. This is also one where I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them on social media or Patreon at patreon.com/forensictales. You can also send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com. As of the time this episode is released, Robert is currently on death row at the Allen B. Polensky unit in Texas. A new execution date is pending. If you'd like to follow this case for yourself, I encourage you to subscribe to the Innocence Project website. They have the latest news and updates. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to support the show and help fund research, production, and editing, you can do so with a small monthly contribution on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive bonus content. You can learn more at patreon.com/forensictales. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a positive rating or review really helps others discover it. For a full list of sources used in this episode, visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.